Pros 2. I have listened carefully and agree that chance is as you say, but within this series of connected causes, does our will have any freedom? Or are the motions of human souls also bound by the fatal chain? There is free will, philosophy answered, and no rational nature can exist which does not have it. For any being, which by its nature has the use of reason, must also have the power of judgment by which it can make decisions, and by its own resources distinguish between things which should be desired and things which should be avoided. Now everyone seeks that which he judges to be desirable, but rejects whatever he thinks should be avoided. Therefore, in rational creatures there is also freedom of desiring and shunning. But I do not say that this freedom is the same in all beings. In supreme and divine substances there is clear judgment, uncorrupted will, and effective power to maintain what they desire. Human souls, however, are more free while they are engaged in contemplation of the divine mind, and less free when they are joined to the bodies, and still less free when they are bound by earthly fetters. They are in utter slavery when they lose possession of their reason and give themselves wholly to vice. For when they turn away their eyes from the light of supreme truth to mean and dark things, they are blinded by a cloud of ignorance and obsessed by vicious passions. By yielding and consenting to these passions, they worsen the slavery to which they have brought themselves, and are, as it were, the captives of their own freedom. Nevertheless, God, who beholds all things from eternity, foresees all these things in his providence, and disposes each according to its predestined merits. Poem 2. He sees all things, hears all things. Sweet-voiced Homer sings of the clear light of bright Phoebus, but the sun's weak rays cannot pierce the bowels of the earth nor the depths of the sea. It is not so with the creator of this great sphere. No mass of earth, no dark and clouded night can resist his vision which looks down on all things. He sees at once, in a single glance, all things that are, or were, or are to come. Since he is the sole observer of all things, you may call him the true sun. Prose 3. Now, I am confused by even greater difficulty, I said. What is it? Philosophy answered, though I think I know what is bothering you. There seems to be a hopeless conflict between divine foreknowledge of all things and the freedom of human will. For if God sees everything in advance and cannot be deceived in any way, whatever his providence foresees will happen, must happen. Therefore, if God foreknows eternally not only all the acts of men, but also their plans and wishes, there cannot be freedom of will. For nothing whatever can be done or even desired without its being known beforehand by the infallible providence of God. If things could somehow be accomplished in some way other than that which God foresaw, his foreknowledge of the future would no longer be certain. Indeed, it would be merely uncertain opinion, and it would be wrong to think that of God. I cannot agree with the argument by which some people believe that they can solve this problem. They say that things do not happen because providence foresees that they will happen, but on the contrary, that providence foresees what is to come because it will happen. And in this way, they find the necessity to be in things, not in providence. For, they say, it is not necessary that things should happen because they are foreseen, but only that things which will happen be foreseen. As though the problem were whether divine providence is the cause of the necessity of future events, or the necessity of future events is the cause of divine providence. But our concern is to prove that the fulfillment of things which God has foreseen is necessary, whatever the order of causes, even if the divine foreknowledge does not seem to make the occurrence of future events necessary. For example, if a man sits down, the opinion that he is sitting must be true, and conversely, if the opinion that someone is sitting be true, then that person must necessarily be sitting. Therefore, there is necessity in both cases. The man must be sitting, and the opinion must be true. But the man is not sitting because the opinion is true. The opinion is true because the sitting came before the opinion about it. Therefore, even though the cause of truth came from the one side, necessity is common to both. A similar line of reasoning applies to divine foreknowledge and future events. For even though the events are foreseen because they will happen, they do not happen because they are foreseen. Nevertheless, it is necessary either that things which are going to happen be foreseen by God, or that what God foresees will in fact happen. And either way, the freedom of human will is destroyed. But of course, it is preposterous to say that the outcome of temporal things is the cause of eternal foreknowledge. Yet to suppose that God foresees future events because they are going to happen is the same as supposing that things which happened long ago are the cause of divine providence. Furthermore, just as when I know that a thing is, that thing must necessarily be. So when I know that something will happen, it is necessary that will happen. It follows then that the outcome of something known in advance must necessarily take place. Finally, if anyone thinks that a thing is other than it actually is, he does not have knowledge but merely a fallible opinion. and that is quite different from the truth of knowledge. So if the outcome of some future event is either uncertain or unnecessary, no one can know in advance whether or not it will happen. For just as true knowledge is not tainted by falsity, so that which is known by it cannot be otherwise then as it is known. And that is the reason why knowledge never deceives. Things must necessarily be as true knowledge knows them to be. If this is so, how does God foreknow future possibilities whose existence is uncertain? If he thinks that things will inevitably happen, which possibly will not happen, he is deceived. But it is wrong to say that or even think it, and if he merely knows that they may or may not happen, that is, if he knows only their contingent possibilities, what is such knowledge worth, since it does not know with certainty? Such knowledge is no better than is expressed by the ridiculous prophecy of Tiresias, quote, "Whatever I say will either be or not be," end quote. Divine providence would be no better than human opinion if God judges as men do and knows only that uncertain events are doubtful. But if nothing can be uncertain to him who is the most certain source of all things, the outcome is certain of all things which he knows with certainty shall be. Therefore there can be no freedom in human decisions and actions, since the divine mind, foreseeing everything without possibility of error, determines and forces the outcome of everything that is to happen. Once this is granted, it is clear that the structure of all human affairs must collapse. For it is pointless to assign rewards and punishment to the good and wicked, since neither are deserved. The actions of men are not free and voluntary. Punishment of the wicked in recognition of the good, which are now considered just, will seem quite unjust, since neither the good nor the wicked are governed by their own will, but are forced by the inevitability of predetermination. Vice and virtue will be without meaning, and in their place there will be utter confusion about what is deserved. Finally, and this is the most blasphemous thought of all, it follows that the author of all good must be made responsible for all human vice, since the entire order of human events depends on providence and nothing on man's intention. There is no use in hoping or praying for anything, for what is the point in hope or prayer when everything that man desires is determined by unalterable process? Thus man's only bonds with God, hope and prayer, are destroyed. We believe that our just humility may earn the priceless reward of divine grace, for this is the only way in which men seem able to communicate with God. We are joined to that inaccessible light by supplication before receiving what we ask. But if we hold that all future events are governed by necessity, and therefore that prayer has no value, what will be left to unite us to the sovereign Lord of all things? And so mankind must, as you said earlier, be cut off from its source and dwindle into nothing. Poem 3. What cause of discord breaks the ties which ought to bind this union of things? What God has set such conflict between two truths? Separately each is certain, but put together they cannot be reconciled. Is there no discord between them? Can they exist side by side and be equally true? The human mind, overcome by the body's blindness, cannot discern by its dim light the delicate connections between things. But why does the mind burn with such desire to discover hidden aspects of truth? Does it know what it is so eager to know? Then why does it go on laboriously trying to discover what it already knows? And if it does not know, why does it blindly continue the search? For who would want something of which he is unaware, or run after something he does not know? How can such a thing be found? Or if it found, how would it be recognized by someone ignorant of its form? When the human mind knew the mind of God, did it know the whole in all its parts? Now the mind is shrouded in the clouds of the body, but it has not wholly forgotten itself. And although it has lost its grasp of particulars, it still holds fast to the general truth. Therefore, whoever seeks the truth knows something. He's neither completely informed nor completely ignorant. He works with what he remembers of the highest truth, using what he saw on high in order to fill in the forgotten parts. Prose 4. There's an old difficulty about providence, philosophy answered. It was raised by Cicero in his book on divination, and has for a long time been a subject of your own investigation, but so far none of you has treated it with enough care and conviction. The cause of the obscurity which still surrounds the problem is that the process of human reason cannot comprehend the simplicity of divine foreknowledge. If in any way we could understand that, no further doubt would remain. I shall try to make this clear after I have explained the things which trouble you. First, let me ask why you regard as inconclusive the reasoning of those who think that foreknowledge is no hindrance to the free will, because it is not the cause of the necessity of future things. For do you have any argument for the necessity of future events other than the principle that things which are known beforehand must happen? If, as you have now conceded, foreknowledge does not impose necessity on future events, why must the voluntary outcome of things be bound to predetermined results? For the sake of argument, so that you may consider what follows from it, let us suppose that there is no foreknowledge. Then would the things which are done by free will be bound by necessity in this respect? Not at all. Then let us suppose that foreknowledge exists, but imposes no necessity on things. The same independence and absolute freedom of will would remain. But you would say that even though foreknowledge does not impose necessity on future events, it is still a sign that they will necessarily happen. It must follow then that even if there were no foreknowledge, the outcome of these future things would be necessary. For the signs only show what is, they do not cause the things they point to. Therefore, we must first prove that nothing happens other than by necessity, in order to demonstrate that foreknowledge is a sign of this necessity. Otherwise, if there is no necessity, then foreknowledge cannot be a sign of something that does not exist. Moreover, it is clear that merely based proof does not rest on signs and extrinsic arguments, but is deduced from suitable and necessary causes. But how can it be that things which are foreseen should not happen? We do not suppose that things will not happen if Providence has foreknowledge that they will. Rather, we judge that, although they will happen, they have nothing in their natures which makes it necessary that they should happen. For we see many things in the process of happening before our eyes, just as the chariot driver sees the results of his actions as he quiets his chariot. And this is true in many of our activities. Do you think that such things are compelled by necessity to happen as they do? No, for the results of art would be vain if they were all brought about by compulsion. Then, since they come into being without necessity, these same things were not determined by necessity before they actually happened. Therefore, there are some things destined to happen in the future whose outcome is free of any necessity. For everyone, I think, would say that things which are now happening were going to happen before they actually came to pass. Thus, these things happened without necessity, even though they were known in advance. For just as knowledge of things happening now does not imply necessity in their outcomes, so foreknowledge of future things imposes no necessity on their outcomes in the future. But, you will say, the point at issue is whether there can be any foreknowledge of things whose outcomes are not necessary. For these things seem opposed to each other, and you think that if things can be foreseen, they must necessarily happen. And if the necessity is absent, they cannot be foreseen, and that nothing can be fully known unless it is certain. If uncertain things are foreseen as certain, that is the weakness of opinion, not the truth of knowledge. You believe that to judge a thing is other than it is departs from the integrity of the knowledge. Now the cause of this error lies in your assumption that whatever is known only by the force and nature of things which are known, but the opposite is true. Everything which is known not according to its own power, but rather according to the capacity of the knower. Let me illustrate with a brief example. The roundness of a body is known in one way by the sense of touch, and in another by sight. The sight, remaining at a distance, takes in the whole body at once by its reflected rays, but the touch makes direct contact with the sphere and comprehends it piecemeal by moving it around its surface. Man himself is comprehended in different ways to the senses, imagination, reason, and intelligence. The senses grasp the figure of the thing as it is constituted in matter. The imagination, however, grasps the figure alone without the matter. Reason, on the other hand, goes beyond this and investigates by universal consideration the species itself, which is in particular things. The vision of intelligence is highest yet, and it goes beyond the bounds of the universe and sees with the clear eye of the mind the pure form itself. In all this we chiefly observe that the higher power of knowledge includes the lower, but the lower can in no way rise to the higher. For the senses achieve nothing beyond the material. The imagination cannot grasp a universal species, reason cannot know simple forms. But the intelligence, as though looking down from on high, conceives the underlying forms and distinguishes them among all. But in the same way in which it comprehends the form itself cannot be known to any other power. The intelligence knows the objects of the lower kinds of knowledge, the universals of the reason, the figures of the imagination, the matters of the senses, but not by using reason or imagination or senses. With a single glance of the mind, it formally, as it were, sees all things. Similarly, when reason knows a universal nature, it comprehends all the objects of imagination and the senses without using either. For reason defines the general nature of her conception as follows: man is a biped, rational animal. This is a universal idea, but no one ignores the fact that man is also an imaginable and sensible object, which reason knows by rational conception, rather than by the imagination and senses. Similarly, although the imagination begins by seeing and forming figures with the senses, nevertheless it can, without the aid of the senses, behold sensible objects by an imaginative rather than a sensory mode of knowing. Do you see then how all of these things use their own power in knowing rather than the powers of the objects which are known? And this is proper, for since all judgment is in the act of the one judging, it is necessary that everyone should accomplish his own action by his own power, not by the power of something other than himself. Poem 4. Long ago, the philosophers at the porch of Athens, old men who saw things dimly, believed the sense impressions and images were impressed on the mind by external objects, just as then they used to mark letters on a blank page of wax with their quick pens. But if the active mind can discover nothing by its own powers and merely remains passively subject to the impressions of external bodies, like a mirror reflecting the empty shapes of other things, where does that power come from which dwells in souls and sees all things? What is that power which perceives individual things and, by knowing them, can distinguish among them? What is the power which puts together again the parts it has separated and, pursuing its due course, lifts its gaze to the highest things, then descends again to the lowest, then returns itself to refute false ideas with truth? This is a more effective and much more powerful cause than any which merely receives impressions from material things. Still, the sense impression comes first, arousing the moving powers of the soul and the living body. When light strikes the eyes or sound the ears, the aroused power of the mind calls into action the corresponding species which it holds within, joining them to the outward signs and mixing images with the form it has hidden in itself. Prose 7. Thus, in the case of sentient bodies, external stimuli affect the sense organs, and a physical sensation precedes the activity of the mind, calling the mind to act upon itself, and in this way activate the interior forms which before were inactive. Now if, as I say, in sentient bodies the soul is affected by external bodies, but judges these stimuli presented to the body not passively, but by virtue of its own power, how much more do intelligences which are wholly free from all bodily affections use the power of the mind rather than objects extrinsic to themselves in arriving at judgments? According to the principle, various and different substances have different ways of knowing. There are certain immobile living things which are without any means of knowing other than by sense impressions. Shellfish and other forms of marine life which are nourished as they stick to rocks are creatures of this kind. Beasts which have power of motion, on the other hand, have the impulse to seek and avoid certain things, and they have imagination. But reason is characteristic of the human race alone, just as pure intelligence belongs to God alone. It follows then that the most excellent knowledge is that which by its own nature knows not only its own proper object, but also the objects of all lower kinds of knowledge. What then should we think if the senses and imagination were to oppose reason by arguing that the universe, which reason claims to know, is nothing? Suppose they were to argue that whatever can be sensed or imagined cannot be universal, and that therefore either the judgment of reason is true, and there are no objects of sense knowledge, or since everyone knows that many things can be known by the senses and the imagination, that the conception of reason which regards whatever is sensible and singular, as if it were universal, is vain and empty. And suppose further that reason should answer that it conceives sensible and imaginable objects under the aspect of universality, but that the senses and imagination cannot aspire to the knowledge of universality because their knowledge cannot go beyond corporeal figures. Moreover, reason might continue. In matters of knowledge we ought to trust the stronger and more perfect judgment. In such a controversy, we who possess the power of reason, as well as of imagination and sense perception, ought to take the side of reason. The situation is much the same when human reason supposes that the divine intelligence beholds future events only as reason herself sees them. For if you argue that some things seem not to have certain and necessary outcomes, they cannot be foreknown as certainly about to happen. Therefore you say that there can be no foreknowledge of these things, or if we believe that there is such foreknowledge that the outcome of all things is controlled by necessity. But if we who are endowed with reason could possess the intelligence of the divine mind, we would judge that just as the senses and imagination should accede to reason, so human reason ought justly to submit itself to the divine mind. Let us rise if we can to the summit of the highest intelligence, for there reason will see what in itself it cannot see, that a certain and definite foreknowledge can behold even those things which have no certain outcome, and this foreknowledge is not mere conjecture, but the unrestricted simplicity of supreme knowledge. Poem 5. How varied are the shapes of living things on earth, some there with bodies stretched out, crawling through the dust, spending their strength in an unbroken furrow. Some soar in the air, beating the wind with light wings, floating in easy flight along tracts of air. Some walk along the ground through woods and across green fields. All these, you observe, differ in their varied forms, but their faces look down and cause their senses to grow sluggish. The human race alone lifts its head to heaven and stands erect, despising the earth. Man's figure teaches, unless folly has bound you to earth, that you who look upward with your head held high should also raise your soul to sublime things, lest while your body is raised above earth, your mind should sink to the ground under its burden. Prose 6. Since, as we have shown, whatever is known according to the nature of the knower, and not according to its own nature, let us now consider as far as it is lawful the nature of the divine being, so that we may discover what its knowledge is. The common judgment of all rational creatures holds that God is eternal. Therefore, let us consider what eternity is, for this will reveal both the divine nature and the divine knowledge. Eternity is the whole, perfect, and simultaneous possession of endless life. The meaning of this can be made clearer by comparison with temporal things. For whatever lives in time lives in the present, proceeding from past to future, and nothing is so constituted in time that it can embrace the whole span of its life at once. It has not yet arrived at tomorrow, and it has already lost yesterday. Even the life of this day is lived only in each moving, passing moment. Therefore, whatever is subject to the condition of time, even that which, as Aristotle conceived the world to be, has no beginning and will have no end in a life coextensive with the infinity of time, is such that it cannot be rightly thought to be eternal. For it does not comprehend and include the whole of the infinite life all at once, since it does not embrace the future which is yet to come. Therefore, only that which comprehends and possesses the whole plenitude and endless life together, from which no future thing nor any past thing is absent, can justly be called eternal. Moreover, it is necessary that such a being be in full possession of itself, always present to itself, and hold the infinity of moving time present before itself. Therefore, they are wrong who, having heard that Plato held that this world did not have a beginning in time and would never come to an end, suppose that the created world is co-eternal with its creator. For it is one thing to live an endless life, which is what Plato ascribed to the world, and another for the whole of unending life to be embraced all at once as present, which is clearly proper to the divine mind. Nor should God be thought of as older than his creation in extent of time, but rather as prior to it by virtue of simplicity of his nature. For the infinite motion of temporal things imitates the immediate present of his changeless life. Since it cannot reproduce or equal life, it sinks from immobility to motion and declines from the simplicity of the present into the infinite duration of future and past. And since it cannot possess the whole fullness of its life at once, it seems to imitate to some extent that which cannot completely express, and it does this by somehow never ceasing to be. It binds itself to a kind of present in the short and transitory period, which, because it has a certain likeness to that abiding, unchanging present, gives everything it touches a semblance of existence. But since this imitation cannot remain still, it hastens along the infinite road of time, and so it extends by movement the life whose completeness it could not achieve by standing still. Therefore, if we wish to call things by their proper names, we should follow Plato in saying that God indeed is eternal, but the world is perpetual. Since then every judgment comprehends the subjects presented to it according to its own nature, and since God lives in the eternal present, his knowledge transcends all movement of time and abides in the simplicity of its immediate present. It encompasses the infinite sweep of past and future and regards all things in its simple comprehension as if they were now taking place. Thus, if you will think about the foreknowledge by which God distinguishes all things, you will rightly consider it not to be foreknowledge of future events, but a knowledge of a never-changing present. For this reason, divine knowledge is called providence rather than provision, because it resides above all inferior things and looks out on all things from their summit. Why then do you imagine that things are necessary which are illuminated by this divine light, since even men do not impose necessity on the things they see? Does your vision impose any necessity upon things which you see present before you? Not at all, I answered. Then philosophy went on, if we may aptly compare God's present vision with man, he sees all things in his eternal present, as you see some things in your temporal present. Therefore, this divine foreknowledge does not change the nature and property of things. It simply sees things present before it as they will later turn out to be in what we regard as the future. His judgment is not confused with the single intuition of his mind. He knows all things that are to come, whether necessarily or not. Just as when you happen to see simultaneously a man walking on the street and the sun shining in the sky, even though you see both at once, you can distinguish between them and realize that one action is voluntary and the other necessary. So the divine mind, looking down on all things, does not disturb the nature of things which are present before it, but are future with respect to time. Therefore, when God knows that something will happen in the future and at the same time knows that it will not happen through necessity, that is not opinion but knowledge based on truth. If you should reply that whatever God foresees as happening cannot help but happen, and that whatever must happen is bound by necessity, if you pin me down to this word necessity, I grant that you state a solid truth, but one which only a profound theologian can grasp. I would answer that the same future event is necessary, with respect to God's knowledge of it, but free and undetermined if considered in its own nature. For there are two kinds of necessity. One is simple, as the necessity by which all men are mortals. The other is conditional, as is the case when, if you know that someone is walking, he must necessarily be walking. For whatever is known must be as it is known to be. But this condition does not involve that other simple necessity. It is not caused by the peculiar nature of the person in question, but by an added condition. No necessity forces the man who is voluntarily walking to move forward, but as long as he is walking, he is necessarily moving forward. In the same way, if providence sees anything as present, that thing must necessarily be, even though it may have no necessity by its nature. But God sees as present those future things which result from free will. Therefore, from the standpoint of divine knowledge, these things are necessary because of the condition of their being known by God. But, considered only in themselves, they lose nothing of the absolute freedom of their own natures. There is no doubt then that all things will happen which God knows will happen, but some of them happen as a result of free will. And although they happen, they do not by their existence lose their proper natures by which, before they happened, they were able not to happen. But you may ask, what does this mean to say that these events are not necessary, since by reason of the condition of divine knowledge they happen just as if they were necessary? The meaning is the same in the example I used a while ago of the sun rising and the man walking. At the time they are happening, they must necessarily be happening. But the sun's rising is governed by necessity even before it happens, while the man's walking is not. Similarly, all the things God sees as present will undoubtedly come to pass. But some will happen by the necessity of their natures, others by the power of those who make them happen. Therefore, we quite properly said that these things are necessary if viewed from the standpoint of divine knowledge, but if they are considered in themselves, they are free of the bonds of necessity. In somewhat the same way, whatever is known by the senses is singular in itself, but universal as far as the reason is concerned. But, you may say, if I can change my mind about doing something, I can frustrate providence, since by chance I may change something which providence foresaw. My answer is this: you can indeed alter what you propose to do, but because the present truth of providence sees that you can, and whether or not you will, you cannot frustrate the divine knowledge any more than you can escape the eye of someone who is present and watching you, even though you may, by your free will, vary your actions. You may still wonder, however, whether God's knowledge is changed by your decisions, so that when you wish now one thing, now another, the divine knowledge undergoes corresponding changes. This is not the case, for divine providence anticipates every future action and converts it to its own present knowledge. It does not change as you imagine, foreknowing this or that in succession, but in a single instant. Without being changed, itself anticipates and grasps your changes. God has this present comprehension and immediate vision of all things, not from the outcome of future events, but from the simplicity of his own nature. In this way, the problem you raised a moment ago is settled. You observe that it would be unworthy of God if our future acts were said to be the cause of divine knowledge. Now you see that this power of divine knowledge, comprehending all things as present before it, itself constitutes the measure of all things, and is no way dependent on things that happen later. Since this is true, the freedom of the human will remains inviolate. And laws are just, since they provide rewards and punishment to human wills, which are not controlled by necessity. God looks down from above, knowing all things, and the eternal present of his vision concurs with the future character of our actions. Distributing rewards to the good and punishments to the evil, our hopes and prayers are not directed to God in vain, for if they are just, they cannot fail. Therefore, stand firm against vice and cultivate virtue. Lift up your soul to worthy hopes, and offer humble prayers to heaven. If you will face it, the necessity of virtuous action imposed upon you is very great, since all your actions are done in the sight of a judge who sees all things. The end.